Hello, and welcome to Module 2. Same objectives, same agenda, except now we're in Module 2. So now we're going to be looking in depth at the results and these 4 phases and the milestones that we just talked about. Hopefully it will clarify some of the questions that I'm sure you have. So looking at Fessinger's definition of cognitive dissonance will help, I think, give you a new appreciation for what people go through who are having a psychotic episode. So he defines cognitive dissonance as a state of being in which a person experiences conflict and personal distress because of the perceived inconsistency between 2 beliefs. And typically one of the beliefs is known, the other is not known or has never been experienced before, such as all of a sudden there's an intrusive delusion that's upsetting the person. And there's a discord then between these 2 beliefs, right, that results in behaviors that are incongruent with previously held attitudes, values, emotions, or beliefs. So I really like this definition. Think about it, discuss it, talk about it with your clients. So the metaphor that I use, that we can boil this down into everyday English to share with our clients, is being on the couch. And in this period of recovery, typically the person is brought home from the hospital and parents will say, all they do is lay around. Back in the day when we had intensive outpatient, people would come into when we had day hospital, they would come in and just sit. And we try to get people engaged. And they're like, what's wrong? And they're unwilling to enter the therapeutic one-to-one. This person is not engaging in treatment. When what I learned from this study was that this is such a painful, difficult time. It becomes very autistic in that this person is really all encompassed in themselves, trying to figure out what's happened to me, what's going on. I can't make sense of the world. So what the person is doing is spending time recognizing the effect of psychotic symptoms on their daily functioning. But that means a person has to first understand that the symptoms were psychosis and not reality. So this isn't going to happen in week 1, 2, 3, or 4. This occurs over time once the person feels that, you can encourage them, that there's trust, that they're really being heard. So the measurable outcomes that we're looking for in this phase is a consistent reduction in the psychotic symptoms, resulting in a lessening or a diminution. Certainly not an elimination, but just can we get these symptoms reined in of their emotional, interpersonal, cognitive, and physiological states. But this is dependent upon, number 1, hopefully there's a medication response and that acute psychosis is slammed down. And there's family support. This is 6 to 12 months. Think about other people that have serious brain insults, such as a stroke. Someone could be paralyzed, aphasic, not able to function at all, not able to swallow. But 6 to 12 months later, they're walking, maybe talking with some type of, probably some speech problems, but they're doing it. So there's an inflammatory process that happens with a psychotic episode. And that brain inflammation is dependent on how long they were psychotic before they got into treatment. So if someone has a long DUP, duration of untreated psychosis, then they're going to have a longer time on the couch. So what are we looking at? What are the milestones? We're going to look at the emotional, cognitive, physiological, interpersonal milestones. So emotionally, they're dealing with embarrassment, fear, frustration, inability to handle stress, which results in a loss of self-confidence. I heard so many statements of how embarrassed these young people were at what they did, what they said, while they were experiencing this first break. We need to acknowledge this. Cognitive milestones. We have to deal with confusion. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing because it's generally saying something that got them into treatment. Interpersonal milestones. It's very hard to go out in public. They don't want to be around people. And physiological milestones are this person has used drugs and alcohol. And they'll say, this was the words of my participants, it just takes too much energy to get through and face the day. So if you think about an inflamed brain, maybe some of you have had, and I don't want to imply anything, but maybe you've drank too much alcohol, okay? Or smoked too much weed or whatever. And your brain just doesn't feel right. And you can't function well because your brain is impaired. So try to ramp that up to the level of a psychotic break, where a person loses all touch with reality and then gets on meds and they're adjusting to these meds. So it's very, 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 very fatiguing. We haven't appreciated that fully at all because, we're get into groups, get into this, do that. So we really need to back off, let this person recover, let their brain recover. Most agencies don't like that. They get funded on actively programming. Well, I think that active programming would be sitting quietly with this person while they're in this intensive phase, demonstrating care, concern, talking about some of these components of milestones to achieve. So I've taken these initial milestones of that acute first phase and linked them to the SAMHSA recovery practices. So the recovery practice of renewing hope and commitment can be achieved by acknowledging the frustration and the person's inability to handle stress. Redefining self can be achieved by acknowledging fear and confusion. Incorporating the illness into their life, again, is relating this frustration. Being involved in meaningful activities is a recovery practice that you think, well, how am I going to do that in this first phase when they're just on the couch? Well, we need to acknowledge the difficulty being in public and the difficulty doing group work. Overcoming stigma is acknowledging their fear of saying something wrong. Assuming control recovery practice is assisting this person if needed to get into drug and alcohol detox once they're stable. And the recovery practice of becoming empowered and exercising citizenship can be achieved by acknowledging the loss of self-confidence and the difficulty in re-engaging with society. Recovery practice of managing symptoms is appreciating the extreme fatigue that accompanies psychosis. And finally, the recovery practice of being supported by others can be achieved by acknowledging difficulty in being around people. So you'll notice that the active verb is acknowledge. There's no way you're going to push the person into independent living or going out, to a mall or shopping or getting their groceries when they're in this phase. So we really have to appreciate the complexity of this process and acknowledging to your clients that you are aware of this tremendous internal struggle they're going through. And by sharing with them that other people have told you about the fear, the frustration, the shame, the difficulty going out in public, will do so much to bolster that client's confidence because they're going to know that you understand. Insight, the next phase, is recognizing that illness symptoms are indeed pathological and have created serious consequences in all aspects of life. And it's the ability to understand the origin and progression of symptoms. So one of the young men, as I mentioned earlier, believed that there were these ghosts, and he attributed that to living next to a cemetery. And he said, well, if my parents didn't live next to a cemetery, I probably wouldn't have the ghosts. And I explained, no, that was just a part of the illness and what his brain was doing, trying to make sense of what he was going through. And the third aspect of insight is the ability to internalize and verbalize the consequences of the symptoms. This is a big 3 bullet points here to achieve. So, and you don't want to move into this until you've achieved a few of those milestones in the first phase. So we really have to do a reframe and a regroup on our expectation of speed. Now, these are not linear. You don't finish one and then go to phase 2 and then go to phase 3. They overlay each other. So it's really important to recognize that and to share with your clients, your consumers, that there are a number of milestones that they're going to be working on over the next few months. And everyone in my study said, don't tell me it's going to take me 3 to 5 years. Just tell me there are these milestones and we're going to work on them 1 or 2 at a time. So I just offer that to you. And obviously this is overlaying, as I just mentioned, cognitive dissonance. So these are not linear. So what's my metaphor? This is at the bus depot. And this came from the individuals in my study. They said, just got tired of laying around, so I thought I'd go hang out at the bus depot. And I said, yeah, so tell me about the bus depot. Well, it's kind of dark. Nobody really pays any attention. And you just practice having your symptoms in public and seeing if anybody knows. So one of the participants said he continually heard his name being announced over the loudspeaker with the address of his home and that all the buses were going to be going to his house. And he was looking around and he realized that nobody was paying any attention to him. So nobody really knew that. And then he realized, well, nobody else can hear that except me. And he goes, oh, that's my schizophrenia. So he hung out in the bus depot for quite a while, just practicing having his symptoms. I think it's actually quite brilliant. And if you think about where folks with mental illness kind of hang out, you'll see groups of people that are, at the bus depot hanging around, or they're kind of under the bridge, or they're remote. They're on the fringe of society. They're not integrating back in yet. And I'm going to explain what happens when they're able to actually maybe integrate in and become an active part of society. So what's happening here is they're gaining an understanding of the relationship of their symptoms to the reality that everybody else experiences. They're experimenting with having those symptoms and watching how others respond when they experience subjective symptoms. The measurable outcome is the ability to master the process of conducting reliable reality checks. In other words, in their words, I just had to sort it out. What was real, what wasn't real, what was my brain, what were the tricks my brain was playing on me, and realize that I could manage being out in public and nobody could tell. It's dependent on medication efficacy again, family support, and here's where the treatment team started coming into play. So that early work that we do with patients is not really verbally recognized or acknowledged to you as a provider, but they will come back later and say, oh, it was so wonderful that you just hung out with me. So the ability to recognize the importance of the team, that's not going to happen early on in the illness. Again, think about yourself if you've been really sick and you're not going to work, you don't feel good, you don't want to talk to anybody. And if anybody comes over, you just go, you know what? Thanks for bringing me something, but I can't talk to you. And so we need to realize that a person recovering from a psychotic episode is going through as much of an adjustment and adaptation as anybody is with a serious illness. This is another 6 to 18 months. So what are the milestones here? Emotional milestones in insight is learning how to cope with life now. Cognitively, trying to figure out their own thoughts. Learning to conduct their own reality checks. Getting control of symptoms. Recognizing that there's limitations. And, in their words, just getting used to it. The interpersonal milestones are how to communicate with other people. The physical milestones, the length of time to stabilize from their episode. repeatedly, and you're going to see when I start sharing some of the quotes with you. They'll talk about, well, it was about a year. It was about a year. It was about a year. Think about when you've had something traumatic. We look at anniversary reactions, right? We know this person isn't going to be back to full bore for a year. We got to go through a calendar year. And it was the same thing in recovering from a psychotic episode. So the next phase, cognitive constancy, is defined as a change in attitude and beliefs about the illness that results in stabilizing the emotional, behavioral, and cognitive incongruencies of psychosis. And there becomes stability in all aspects of their behavior because it's based on reality-based attitudes and beliefs. So what's the metaphor? Going to the mall. So the young folks that I was interacting with said, I got tired of hanging out at the bus stop if I go to the mall. Oh, what's going on at the mall? Well, it's light there, and you got to talk to people. And generally you buy something at the mall. And one of the participants, I'm going to share this story with you. He goes, while I was hanging out at the bus depot, I heard this really cool CD. And I wanted that CD. But I was really afraid to go to the mall because if I did it wrong, they'd call the mall police. And they'd take me back to jail or back to the hospital. I was really afraid of that. So I had a good friend, and he was helping me figure out how to do this because, you go to the music store at the mall, and there's all of those, categories you have to go through, and I was afraid if I did it wrong, I'd call attention to myself. I mean, he was really in anguish about this. And he said, then what if I don't get the right amount of money back? And so my friend, helped me practice. I figured it was probably like $15.98 or something for the CD, and he practiced with the $20 bill and getting change. And so finally, he spent 6 months getting the courage to go to the mall to buy this CD. So his friend said, do you want me to go with you? And he said, no, I have to do it by myself. But he said, hang outside the music store in case I do it wrong and they call the mall police, you can explain. And I just, listening to him tell this story. So he said, I did it. I was able to do it. And that was the beginning of my recovery. I thought, that seems like such a little thing. But those of you who have worked in any kind of case management know that these are really big things. So you're looking at the ability to cognitively achieve stability in thinking and responding to others, forcing themselves to interact with others. And what I found was actually the praxis, the real linchpin of this study was that until a person can initiate and maintain meaningful conversation with others, they're not ready to go to school, get a GED, go for a job interview. So if your client is still, no, whatever, you tell me, that's not the time to try to get them to go into independent living. So we have measurable outcomes that I define as the ability to muster the internal grit to begin, not achieve, begin re-engaging in age-appropriate activities related to work and school. And effectively re-engage in interpersonal relationships by initiating and maintaining conversation. So it's dependent upon what happened when they first got sick, that initial first episode psychosis experience. So if somebody the cops were called, they're hauled in with handcuffs and sitting in an ER with all of this stuff going on in their head, that's going to make it harder for them to go out into society. So we really need to find out what was it like. So those of you who are working in the first episode group, you have the chance to totally shape the future of your client. And there were folks in my study that said, you know, it was so bad when I first went to the hospital, I was really afraid to almost leave my house because I was afraid I would go bad. And as a nurse, that just absolutely tore my heart out. Then there are others who said, you know, the hospital saved my life. So I certainly don't mean to imply that going to the hospital is bad. But for some people, it's a really negative experience. They need a dependable support system. Oftentimes, families have burned out. Or if you got them early, you can get families that can really engage. So it's super important for a support system. They need to be able to have constructive use of their time. And medications need to be efficacious. But now that's down at number 4. Whereas the last 2 phases, they were pretty dependent on, do we have meds that work? This is 1 to 3 years. So, what's it like, this mustering the grit to re-engage with previous life activities? Well, you need the acceptance of the need for treatment, to think positive, to have control over their treatment, to feel safe, to be around people, to constructively manage their time. And again, I'm going to emphasize this over and over again. They need to be effectively, and to effectively be able to re-engage in normal relationships. So they can also verbalize hope. They develop distraction techniques when their symptoms intensify. They're able to take care of their physical needs. And they can actually develop on their own and adhere to a routine. And they realize they're not alone, that others have the same diagnosis. And they get back to previous activities. One of the young men in the study said, you know, when I was finally able to make my truck payments again, I knew I was going to be okay. So, but my dad had to make them for me for almost 3 years. So what are the milestones? Emotionally, they're going to talk to you about the importance of having a positive initial hospital experience. You can't do anything about what happened to them back then, right? But you can listen and acknowledge what that was like. And if you are in the position to work with somebody in their first episode that they are going to have to go to the hospital, how important it is that you can follow through, that you can be there, that to make that positive. The support system needs to be dependable. They need to be able to have something to do with their time, not just leave them alone. They need lots of reassurance and encouragement here. So these milestones are really, you can see where the team can really be instrumental in helping with these milestones. And it's up to you to make the treatment environment feel safe. Don't let people be alone too much. They'll say, don't let me have too much quiet time because the voices come back. And the need to be around people. And ultimately, having hope. So important to have hope. We all know that. Okay, what's going on cognitively? They need to be able to distract themselves from the symptoms. They need to accept the need for treatment. And they learn, I'm not the only one that has this illness. Not accepting the need for treatment, okay, that's way down here in phase 3. Okay, the person's got to experiment, right? They're going to go off their meds. They're going to find out, hey, I think there is something really wrong, and I do need to be in treatment. Everybody's on their own trajectory for that. So we need to be there to help people pick up the pieces. And they need to do what they used to do. Get back to it. Think positive. This is where giving choices is helpful. This is where there's the brain power to go, okay, here's my options. You know, if I do this, this will happen. If I do this, that'll happen. They need to have cause and effect reasoning to be able to deal with choices. So don't give people choices before their ability to have cause and effect reasoning returns. Interpersonally, have someone listen to me, understand me. This came out so strongly. And talk to me about me. What I like to do, not just about my symptoms, not just about my diagnosis, not just about my meds, not just about, case management, but what I like to do, sports, going outside, music, whatever, right? They need to have confidence in the counselor or therapist. And so many folks talked about that when they got sick in high school, and the high school counselor said, oh, there's nothing really wrong with you, it's just your hormones. Well, no, it's a whole lot more than just hormones. They want people to be honest with reality and tell me, this is the place to start maybe chipping away at a little delusional thought. Like, well, what's the evidence here? So we need to be honest with folks. But in those first two phases, you got to kind of roll with what they're experiencing, right? Because that's their experience. It's only when they get to the mall phase, it's like, oh, wow, okay, there is really something wrong here. I got to deal with it. This is where psychoeducation is most beneficial. This is the time to explain things to your client. And talk about general things, okay? Talk about the weather, talk about cars, whatever is this person's interest. And there's going to be grieving here. Talking about, I wish I'd had help when I was first sick. So again, those of you working in the New Journeys program, you can change this. That this doesn't even become a discussion point. It just automatically, they had help when they were first sick. But they're going to reflect back on that when they get to the mall phase, because they're going to go, oh yeah, okay, when I got sick, you were there, or somebody was there for me if I do have another relapse. They're living in fear of relapse a lot. And we have to acknowledge that. We have to at least know that. Okay, physically, the right med, being able to take care of their body, and having a routine. These are the three major areas to focus on. Okay, the last phase, ordinariness. The ability to consistently and reliably engage in and complete normal activities of daily living that are reflective of pre-psychosis functioning, that it will never be identical. You have a psychotic break, your life has changed. And people will either get back to normal, they'll be maybe a little bit better with some insight, or worse. But it will never be the same. So we have to recognize that, and we have to be patient with that. We have to help the person be okay with that. So the metaphor is finally back to school or work. And they can perform age-appropriate ADLs like other people do. This becomes really problematic. I know one of my patients that taught me so much got sick in his senior year at WSU and, ended up in the hospital, came on my caseload. And so he was 22 and when he got sick. And by the time he got stable, he was about 26. And he said, well, I'm going to go back and finish at WSU. I'm going to go back and live in the fraternity house. I said, it's going to be different for you to go back there at 26 than when you were 22. And he goes, it'll be okay. And of course, the person doesn't realize that their emotional growth and development stops at the age at which they became ill. So even though he's chronologically 26, developmentally he was 22 and still in college. So he went back, he got readmitted. I helped him with that. And he insisted on going back to the fraternity house. The fraternity let him in. But, so he came for a visit, for a session, and he goes, well, none of my friends were still at the fraternity house. It was a different house parents. He was just shocked that the world had moved on and that really was difficult for him. It took several months of him realizing, my friends they're married, they've got children, they've got jobs, and I've been a mental patient. It was very heartbreaking working with him. He eventually moved through that and came to terms, and he was able to get an apartment and finish his classes. But it was really a huge wake-up call for him. So again, I asked you to be sensitive to that. So what are we looking at here for a measurable outcome? The ability to successfully enroll in and complete a desired course of study, and or successfully sustaining employment, and maybe it's 2 days a week, okay, it's not full-time, for a year. The recovery literature will tell you it's so important to go a year without a relapse. And that's dependent upon an absence of cognitive dissonance, which is meaning we're not having a full-blown relapse. And do they have the ability to complete age-appropriate activities related to work and school? Or do you got to stop and do this emotional pick up the pieces and developmentally let this person know, whoa, okay, so if somebody was 16 when they got sick and now they're 20, they don't have near the life skills that they've learned as a person who got sick at 22. So knowing what age those symptoms the person was at when they got those symptoms is really critical for helping get through this particular milestone. And this is a couple of years. I think some of us are still working on our ordinariness. So what are the milestones? Emotionally, it's being able to think about the future, achieving their life goals, having my own place to live, cognitively, managing symptoms, finishing my education, becoming employed, and interpersonally, do what other people do. I just think that's beautiful. And there are no physical milestones in ordinariness because they're back on track with their body, with exercise, with diet, good nutrition. So let's look at the map of the world of recovery here. So we've got cognitive dissonance, 6 to 12 months. Insight, 6 to 18 months. Cognitive constancy, 1 to 3 years. And ordinariness, 2+. So if we look at this, and all systems are go, you can be through that first phase on the couch in 6 months. You can get through the mall, or the bus depot in 6 months. So that's a year. That's pretty fast. And get to the mall in a year. So if you had a really good intensive, as I know you do, 2-year program that's targeted to look at these psychological recovery milestones, you can have a client doing pretty doggone good at the end of 2 years. And then, like I said, I think we're all working on ordinariness. So here's a summary of the 4 phases of cognitive dissonance, insight, cognitive constancy, and ordinariness. So with that, we are through Module 2, and you can take a break or go immediately to Module 3. Thank you. See you in a minute.